All right, well, it is 2:01, so we will go ahead and get our session kicked off. My name is Vanessa Young. I'm a marketing manager here at Avap, and I'm super excited that you're joining us here today. We have Angelo and Judith with us, and they're going to give us a great session on organizational resilience. But before we get started, I just want to mention that today's session is being recorded, and everyone will receive the recording in their inbox in about 2 days. So feel free to watch it again, share with your colleagues. Also want to mention that today's session is interactive. We'll be using Mentimeter polling, so please have your phone, tablet, another window open on your computer, and we'll get to that in a little bit. Also want to mention if you have any questions during today's session, please use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen or the chat function. And then also, last thing I want to mention is that there will be a survey at the end of today's session. It would be great if everyone could complete it. Just gives us a better idea of what sessions you'd like to see in the future. And with that, we can go ahead and get started, Angelo and Judith.
Well, thank you, Vanessa. First of all, I would like to introduce you to Avap. That's our company. Avap is an industry-focused technology management and advisory consulting firm. We partner with market-leading software platforms and offer a full suite of advisory services, including system selection, process excellence, change management, and many other things. Since Avap started in 2006, we have received more than 100 company awards for our community involvement and being a best place to work. With more than 300 employees across the United States, we have over 200 customers, from large, well-known colleges and universities to state agencies, large hospitals and healthcare providers, nonprofits, and more. My name is Angelo Mazzocco, and I'm the Vice President of Advisory Services. I have over 30 years in the industry. 20 of those years has been as a CIO at 3 different organizations. The rest of that time, for the most part, was in the area of consulting. I'd like to introduce my partner in crime, Judith Schouten. And Judith is a principal consultant in our organizational change management group. Judith?
Thank you, Angelo, and hello to everyone. I'm so glad you can join us for this conversation. As Angelo mentioned, my name is Judith Schouten. And my area of expertise is really in change management, and I've been very fortunate to really work in the people space for the last 20 years. And I'm very excited to be joining you today and to be really kicking off this conversation. And so with that, I'm going to kind of take us through our agenda. As you know, we already went over our introductions and logistics, and so we're going to talk about resilience today, look a little bit and have some conversations around change fatigue, and then we want to talk about 2022 and looking ahead. I can't believe we're almost at the end of the first quarter, and now is a great time to kind of take some stock and look ahead to what you want the rest of the year to look like. So with that, as was mentioned, we're going to use Mentimeter. So I'm inviting everyone to take out your phones, or if you want to open up another browser. And Amy right now is going to drop in the link to our Mentimeter polling. There it is. Thank you, Amy. And we just want to kind of warm up and get us all kind of focused on resiliency. So I want everyone just to complete the first question, and that's going to be around what attributes do you think are foundational to organizational resilience? So think about your experience, think about what you're reading about. You can put 1, you can put 5. So just enter them into the Menti. I'll give everyone a minute, and then we'll dive in. And at any time, please put in your questions, your thoughts. We really want this to be a discussion, and I look forward to seeing what you put in the Menti and in the comments. So just give everyone a minute, take some time. Okay, Thank you. So a great place to start, and Angelo and I, we've talked about this a lot, so we're pretty grounded in this, but we want to bring you all into the conversation. And where Angelo and I have really started is around defining resilience. What do we mean when we say resilience? Awesome, thank you, Melissa. What do we really mean? And, you know, where do we want to start? So I think of resilience, you know, when we look at the first definition, it's really from a physics perspective. It talks about the capability of a strained body to recover its size and shape, especially compressive stress, right? So I think that's very interesting as I thought about this and we've molded over. And the definition we're probably all a little more familiar with is really the ability to recover from or adjust easily to misfortune or change. And as Angelo and I've had this conversation, we actually would like to take our definition a step further. And it's not only being able to recover, right? It's really, resilience is really about being transformed by those changes, being transformed by those challenges, often to the point where you come out better than maybe you went into this stressful event. So that's how we know you're really building up that resilience. And I think it's in the news, it's in research right now, but we also have talked about, Angela and I, that this is not new, right? Resiliency and change and stressful situations aren't new. So Angelo, I would love it if you could take us through maybe some of the catalysts of change over the last couple years and even further back.
Sure, I would be glad to do that. You know, what we've got here outlined are about 9 different change agents that really caused us all to get resilient. We all had to overcome these issues. And so certain things like having to adapt to new technology, whether it's laptops and desktops, or adapting to the internet. You know, it wasn't all that long ago. If you look at the mid-90s, when we had the internet boom. Some of us remember the big Y2K days, right? The war on terror, which I think in some ways is still going on, but we've certainly had to gain resiliency there. The Great Recession, the rise of social media, COVID, supply chain, Great Resignation, etc., and even the events of the past year or so. The ones that I remember the best, and if I think of the 3 times that I was a CIO, so I had to be very involved in each one of them, was first of all, Y2K. And we had a company of 20 organizations and a huge number of technology and programs and things of that sort that needed to be purified to make sure that we were going to be ready for Y2K. You know, it seemed like we finally made it through Y2K, and the next thing we knew, at that same time, we had 9/11. And I was working for one of the major media companies, and sure enough, we had anthrax beginning to get delivered to our organization because they were trying to get the anthrax to reporters or anchor people on the TV side, things like that. And it really put a scare in all of us because we began to see that we couldn't trust the mail. If you couldn't trust the mail, what could you trust? It wasn't long after that the war on terror hit us. And it seemed like time after time, organizations were getting hacked. And I was a CIO at that time at a second organization that dealt in healthcare and pharmacy benefits and things of that sort. And it was a terror in terms of when's it going to happen next? Who's going to be impacted? And then the last example, having worked with a physician group, it had to do with COVID. And, you know, we were so lucky, it seemed each time, that we had in some ways prepared because we had developed video conferencing probably 10, 20 years ago. And it wasn't that used, if you recall. But when COVID came to be, we were ready with video conferencing and we're able to have people work from home. And same with telehealth, which was sort of an offshoot as well of video conferencing. And for us, that meant a lot so that we didn't have to have our physicians and our nurses having to come in contact person to person in every instance with patients who had COVID. So those are some of the things that come to my mind Judith, and maybe you can add to that.
Yeah, Angelo, I think this is like a good starting point. And I think there are other things, and, put in the chat, what you've experienced yourself that were really big change catalysts for you. There's a couple things that come to mind as I look at just this initial list. Some of these things we had time to prepare for, right? So when I think of Y2K, there was like time to talk and to plan and prepare. And then there were other events that maybe there were inklings of signs like the Great Recession, right? That doesn't happen overnight, right? But there's a lead up, but then the impacts are immediate. And then with COVID, right? Similarly, it just happened in a matter of a couple weeks, and then the impact was pretty significant. And so, it's a long list, but there's kind of some similarities to some of these change catalysts, and some of them also just really come out of nowhere. And even the events of this year, I think, we're really, when we think about how we've all been operating for the last couple of years, we've really been operating in this very surge, like dealing with the crisis, right? And there hasn't often been this kind of recovery period, right? And now there's something new on the horizon as we look at the events happening in the international community right now. We're kind of moving from one peak to the next peak without this kind of recovery. And so what has helped organizations and people kind of navigate this timeline? So I think that's a great point to kind of look at our mentee poll and what you all put in there. So, what in your mind, kind of thinking about, these peaks and these trials, right, of this crisis and these change catalysts, right? What were some of the attributes that were really foundational? It doesn't look like our mentee is coming up right this second, but put in the chat. Yeah, drop in the chat. Thanks, Melissa. Drop it in the chat. What attributes, do you think are foundational? I think we had some around flexibility. I love that. Thoughts around communication. Let's see if it comes up. What about collaboration? Support. I love that. Yeah. Transparent. Patience. Yeah, there's a lot. Oh, see, here it comes. Here it comes. So some of them, what we're talking about, but put it in the chat, as you, and we'll kind of do a shout out of some of the things that you've seen that were really helpful, that allowed organizations to sustain. So yeah, we'll just go out to the mentee again. Leadership. Yep, transparency, empathy. I love that one. Empathy is really an important skill, right? We often think about it as something over here, but it's really essential to resiliency. And research, which is great. There's been so much research in this area. Some of it related to the events on the previous slide, and some of it related to the events of the last 2 years. Like, how do we maintain the surge? How do we get resilient? I love this. Tenacity, creative, and life purpose. That is awesome. And if we go vision, if we go to the next slide, the research supports what you were just sharing, right? Attributes of resilient organizations. And as I say these, think about your own organizations or organizations you support, and which one of these do you really identify with? Which one have you seen in play over the last couple of years? Yes, purpose. So preparation, right? Angela and I talked a lot about this. Angela and I had like a catchphrase where you're prepared, you have a plan, and we like to call it plan and pivot, because you can't get so rooted in that plan, but you are prepared. You have a framework for dealing with difficulties. The next thing that research shows us, right, is resilient organizations are adaptable, they're change agile, and that flexibility that we just talked about on the previous slide. Resilient organizations also are transparent, collaborative, and communicate. So really they break down those silos. They're very transparent. They have candor, which really goes next with the trust, right? In times of crisis, you have to have a very high trust bank built up so that things can work smoothly, even in the absence of information. So really having that trust, peer-to-peer, peer-to-leader, leader-to-leader, is so important. And I think someone put it in the chat, really that like responsibility and that purpose beyond the bottom line. I think we saw that a lot in the pandemic, and put in the chat what you saw is, you know, organizations moving from their operations in one area, moving them to support the pandemic, whether it was making hand sanitizer or changing the operations for grocery delivery or making masks, right? Just really going to where the need was. And so, Angelo, and also the audience, as you look at this list, that research says that these are the attributes. Does this ring true to you? What have you seen?
You know, Judith, and of course, my horizon is going to be longer than some of the others, but I actually started work professionally in the 70s. And at that time, it was very odd to me because I thought I was going into all this technical work. And I discovered right away that companies had these things called disaster recovery plans. And it was odd because it was sort of on the negative, right? Disaster recovery. Should we have a disaster? Here's what we should do. And we had these books at that time, hard copy, that told us what to do should something go wrong, whether that was with the electricity, the technology, no matter what it was, there was going to be a plan. Not long after that, it seemed like in the 80s, the more positive side came through, and we started to refer to these as business continuity plans, so that should there be an issue, we would continue to operate as a company. And those are where I think the plan and pivot started for me, because it was not long after that when we started to have some of the big items occur, like Y2K, like 9/11, that the first thing we began to do was to find our disaster recovery business continuity plan and figure out what should we change so that we would be even more prepared. Because, you know, the thing that happens is over time, more and more things occur that you weren't planning for, and you've got to somehow now write that in so that you're prepared should that happen again. And that, to me, I think was a point of trust, because you knew it may not be perfect for this time, but it gave us a starting point so that we could begin somewhere, and we wouldn't have to rethink everything that went bad in the last 20 years. We were up to date.
Yeah, it's almost like all that planning and preparation really built up that muscle and that framework for how you were going to address these unknown challenges of the future. I can think about some of our clients and some of the things they've done for continuity of operations. And some of the things have been as simple as they were very close to a nuclear facility. And in every desk, right, they had a small iodine pill, right? And they walked you through that. And they said, we're probably never going to need this, right? But we want to build up the trust that we're taking care of you and that we know the challenges of our location. We're grounded in the reality of the situation. We don't think anything bad's going to happen, but just in case. And that builds up a lot of trust because, you know, the employees often saw it's like, yes, we're grounded in reality. Our leaders know where we're located. Probably nothing will ever happen, but it's good to know what to do if something does happen, that they have a plan, and then I can execute that plan, and that will lead to safety, physical or psychological safety, and that they're really responsible for their people beyond the products that they were making, beyond what they were delivering. And I think, although that's a very specific type of example, you know, I want us to all to think about how are we prepared, how are we communicating, and building up that trust, that we will help create these environments where we will be resilient because we have built up these muscles. But then the other thing is the pace. We kind of talked about these peaks and these trials, like the very cataclysmic events happen. And then we kind of have a recovery period What are you seeing when we go from crisis to crisis to crisis, Angela? What is happening from your perspective in organizations, from some of our clients?
I think that the stress is building and building and building, and there are some individuals who are having a difficult time handling that. So I think that's the challenge that, like you said with Y2K, we had the opportunity once it was over to take a breath and sort of rest and say, wow, that was something. We didn't have near the catastrophe we thought there was going to be, and we did our job in preparation. But when you have situations like we've had more recently with COVID, with other things that seem to be continuous, it seems as though you never get that rest. The one that I'll remember forever is it was just a couple of weeks ago when we thought that COVID was coming to an end, and thank goodness it may be, but we've said that before, and then the war started, and it was like I probably heard 10 people say, "Gosh, we didn't even get a chance to have a week off." Now we have to be worried about something else. So, a lot of what we've talked about have to do with organizations, but think about what we do personally too in a very similar way. You hear about, some families have it more difficult with others because of the changes they have to go through. But, we're focused here, but it's very easy to look at the individual just as well.
Yeah, and we've seen some things in the chat. You're certainly right. What I would say, what we define that as, and we want to kind of talk about next, is this surge capacity, right? This going from crisis to crisis, the never a break, the never knowing what's next, has really contributed to a large amount of change fatigue. And when we think about change fatigue, it is a challenge for organizations. It is something related to COVID, related to inflation, related to international situations. And we have to be honest as leaders and as those who support leaders and individuals and organizations, like what is that doing to our workforce? And I think on the next slide, we kind of go into, 73% of organizations reported being near, at, or past the point of change saturation. That's a lot. That isn't, just one team feeling stressed to get a product to market. That's saying that we are really on the cusp of something. And, we use the term change fatigue. We've talked about this a lot, Angelo and I. But, people aren't going around very often saying, I'm so change fatigue, right? It's showing up. And recognizing the signs of change fatigue is something we all need to do for ourselves, right? For our teammates. Crankiness, I love that, Melissa, right? This loss of productivity, right? And stress and illness, I think is something, Angela, you've talked a lot about. Negativity, right? How are people just showing up? You present an idea, and instead of, providing something that's constructive, people just go negative first, right? And what's happening, especially when that's not the normal way of interaction. And lower engagement. I think there was just an article today that talked about your once a year employee engagement survey is not enough, right? Because of what's happening. So Angela, what do you think about this list? What do you want to add? And also to those who are, putting in the chat, what are your thoughts?
I think that, Judith, if you continue to get negativity thrown at you and you have to deal with it, I think that what overtakes you is sadness. Mm-hmm. It's not certainly joyful happiness, and it becomes a difficult thing. I think that's how we build our resilience. On the other hand, right, we learn mm-hmm. how to overcome it. We learn how to deal with it. But yeah. you're having to deal with this sadness, and I think that sadness is what causes stress. Some people get ill. Everybody deals with these things in a very different way. Some people, look at how many people we saw that created the Great Resignation, where, hey, I'm just going to go this is the time I have to go do something different. I want to go to another job. It will maybe be different there. And, I know some of us liked working from home, but others of us didn't. It's those introverts, extroverts. There are people like me that if I'm around people, I get energized. But if I'm working in a room by myself, I don't get as energized. So I think all these things sort of was a domino effect that we had to deal with.
Yeah.
And the results of that in some cases may have been positive, but I think in a lot of others, it was not.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I love what's happening in the chat right now. So I just want to turn to that for a second. Pam, I think you were saying it's, again, those difficult conversations, right? Because more than ever, and so again, this is some of the silver lining, our personal lives were colliding in a way that they never had with work and what we were doing and the challenges we were facing, disconnected, so that change becomes an individual event instead of pulling everyone together. I love that because people feel isolated, right? They don't know how others are experiencing the change or dealing with the stresses. Am I the only one, right? I feel isolated because I'm working in my home office and I don't interact with another human. Or maybe I'm, dealing with elder care or child care issues, right? That never impeded my work before. And now they're very present and it's very difficult. I think sometimes you see different people responding to emails at like 2 a.m. And, sometimes if it's a one-time event, but if it becomes normal and, it's not healthy for them, maybe there's some opportunity there. Maybe they're feeling overwhelmed. Maybe that's a signal. So I think we have another mentee poll and I love, so everyone go back to the mentee, again, take out your phone, right? And, I just want to, for this group, what percentage of your organization or organizations you're supporting are experiencing a degree of change fatigue? And thinking about, is it isolated to one team? Is it happening throughout the organization? And if you had to give an estimate of what percentage would you say is really being impacted by change fatigue? Especially one thing we haven't really talked about is, and you're seeing this in the news too, in companies, is return to office strategies. What does that look like? If you're someone who's been looking forward to returning to office and you go hybrid and you're only allowed one day, how are you doing with that? Oh, Amy, can you drop in the link one more time? Thank you. So yeah, go out to the link, or if you're having problems with the link, just drop it in the chat. And, so I think, return to office, we were just talking about this, Pam, we were on a meeting, we were just talking about return to office is a new, it's a new catalyst, right? And it's going to create new communities and new opportunities. And I love that everyone is change fatigue. And it's also going to involve some loss, right? And we think about change models, talk about grief and how difficult that is. When you're losing something, even if it wasn't ideal, right, there is that transition, there is that energy that's being lost as you transition to what's new and what's the future. The other thing I've heard some organizations say is that we're returning to something, but for a lot of us, it's recreating this new future, right? That requires new energy and new thinking. And while exciting, right, it is a lot, right? And I think what we're seeing is a lot of us on this call and then on this webinar, we're experiencing very high degrees, 50 to 70%, which kind of matches what the other research says on the previous slide. And also I would say, like, how are you, right? We have individual observations with our teams, with our friends, with our families, right? We know that this is really peaking and it's been a lot. So we've just kind of had this conversation. We know it's an issue. We know it's a challenge. So what do we do about it? And so I think on the next slide, we talk about, what can you do to build resilience now, right now, and beyond. And I know the article that was dropped in the chat, that's something one of my teams is doing. So I encourage everyone after this, not right now, to go out. There is a great, I think it's Harvard business article, about what you can do, some of the tactics. But the first thing that often comes to mind is applying, what we consider fundamental change management techniques, right? Around creating space for awareness, understanding the change, understanding the impacts. And what I think I've talked about before is also prioritizing change, right? Looking at the body of changes that are happening to employees and really understanding the magnitude of the impact at an individual level and prioritizing things. Not everything has to happen all at once. And, sometimes we have all these great ideas, but we really need to take a look at the human impact and and have a human-centered approach. And, again, using technology, right? And Angelo, I know you're going to talk about this in a second, but, we have all these new tools. We can take polls like, how is your energy, or how are you feeling today? Are you happy face, neutral face, or sad face? And what's happening, right? I love that turnover and retention, right? Is that higher? Is that, and what can you do? So first thing, apply change management techniques. Angelo, what do you have for us?
Well, I think that you hit it. Really, what is at the core is communication. I think that, when you're in times of uncertainty, or you're just not sure what's next, having a discussion with others to see that you're not alone, to see that, others are in it with you is very important. I think the technology enhances the communication. Like earlier, we were talking about telehealth and how in certain situations, it just makes sense for doctors and nurses to not jeopardize their health in treating others. And that's a perfect example. It made no sense whatsoever for doctors and nurses to come down with COVID at the same time that their patients were. And other technologies, look at how we've all gone to the video society all of a sudden, it seems, right? You realize 4 years ago, we had this technology, we just never used it. We did not feel the purpose was there. Today we do.
Mm-hmm.
We need to communicate and do so more than just in person. And we've answered with the technology. And I can keep going on and on and on, but I'll give you a chance, Judith, too.
Yeah, and I think yes and, right? So Melissa, you'd be so proud, right? Yes and, right? Kind of really jumping off. There are so many things we can do. I love the idea of, just checking in. Like we have that, I think it's second to last on our list, is like, ask how others are doing. Not everyone is being impacted by these changes in the same way. Identify, within your team, even ask yourself, do a self check-in. How am I feeling? How am I showing up to these things? And, sometimes it's just really that connection. I think, Kate, you put in the chat, creating connection builds trust and relationships. And how do we use technology, right? So I love that regardless of where we are located, we can use technology. But also we have to remember that technology is a tool, right? And, we had another leader who shared that if a Zoom meeting or a WebEx doesn't have a defined agenda or doesn't have a defined outcome, he tends to reject that meeting and ask for it to be communicated some other way, really looking at synchronous and asynchronous ways of connecting. I think it's so important. And then, we really talk about, cultivating supportive environments, right? Psychological and physical safety are so important, especially when that's being challenged in different ways. And how do we create, not redundancies, but prevent single points of failure so people feel like they can't raise their hand and say, hey, I need a day off, or I need some support. How do we cultivate that, right? And some ways is by leaning in ourselves and sharing, like, it's okay to, take your days off, right? It's okay to need to say no to a couple meetings, right? It doesn't make you a poor employee. In fact, it makes you a good example that we need to treat ourselves as the whole human. So I'm seeing more in the chat. Angelo, what else? What else are you thinking about?
I love this one chat item that we got from Pamela.
Mm-hmm.
Pamela said that she was a disaster preparedness officer in the Air Force for her squad. I can't imagine having, obviously there are more difficult jobs, but that is really a tough one for me because that's your job every day, is to make sure you are prepared for the upcoming disaster. And that is something that I think reminds me that when we are in difficult times, I might tend to ask advice of Pamela because that's what she does. She deals with that every day. I remember having a discussion with a policeman one time about those kinds of things, about how do you deal with the stress of the constant you don't know and you have to deal with something. So I think that we all have to find our sources, and that's a great source, are the people around us.
Yes, I mean, and lean on each other, right? And we do that by connecting with one another. And now that we know that Pam has this skill set, Pam, you're inviting us all to lean into that. And what other resources, experiences do we all share in? I think that's really important. And through connecting and communication and creating our communities, we also build up resilience that can trickle throughout the organization by demonstrating those right behaviors. That it's okay to ask for help. In fact, we need to. We can't be an expert in everything. It's just impossible. And how do we support each other, and how do we build up our skills? How do we create these opportunities to demonstrate resilience and to create an organization that supports that? So I think, please continue to put in the chat. I love this conversation. We're going to go back to the mentee, right? So I guess, what will you do in 2022? I think people have already put in there. I love this. So we have integrate org design and change management. I love that. Employee surveys to gauge where your baseline for resilience is. That's a really great idea. And tenacity, creativity, and life purpose. Defining that. Are you writing it down, right? Simple things. Do a check with yourself, right? Ask your team, are they aligned on the purpose of what you're all doing, right? Once we understand our purpose, it's often very easy to feel good about what we're doing and have a positive framing. Grow. Excellent. Growth is always good. How are we challenging ourselves? How are we filling up our cups? How are we filling up our team's cups? Does the organization support that? And if it doesn't, what are some ways that we can influence that? Angelo, jump on in.
Sure. Well, I remember when COVID started up, and I was CIO with a physician group, and one of the physicians, Dr. Chen, was from Wuhan. And so his family was feeling the impact in China right away, immediately. And I remember him saying, we need to take this seriously. And it caused us really entirely to take it serious and begin to think about our plan, our sort of disaster recovery plan, should anything go wrong. And by golly, I'm glad we did that. Well, just the past few days, I was talking with my wife last night, and we had seen where the COVID numbers were falling and almost coming down to nothing. And it's very easy to think, okay, we're done with that, on to the next thing. And on the late news last night, we heard that in China, the numbers are coming back up. So, one of the things about creating a business continuity plan or a disaster recovery plan is that it teaches you to sort of look for the things you saw before. And what happened before was that China was up and everybody else was down, and nobody paid attention to it. And then all of a sudden, boom, the rest of the world had it too. So I'm not wishing anything bad like that. I hope that we'll be smarter this time, but I know that was an item that came to me just last night, because I had no idea, and I'm sure many of you did, where you're more up on the news, but it hit me last night that China is sort of back where they were at the very beginning in the Wuhan days. So anyway, I wanted to throw that in. I think that it's important to reconsider, because now we have additional stress. We have the war going on, and with Russia and the Ukraine, and who knows what will happen there. But I think that learning to deal with that working together, communicating are going to be the important things.
Yeah, I know the news can be a lot, and however you get it, right? And our organizations, we all have different challenges and opportunities. And we really all need to be grounded in the reality of the environment today and what some of those challenges are. And then how do we go back to those key attributes, looking at how do we understand our environment, right? Resilient people and organizations are grounded in the reality of the situation. Neither good nor bad, what we're just the challenge we're facing. And then how do we continue to plan and pivot? How do we continue to focus on our change agility? What support are we giving that? How are we building up that capability? And how are we communicating? How are we being transparent about some of the challenges? I think I just saw an article by Ford Motor Company. They're going to send out some of their vehicles without the chips because if they wait for supply chain, they're not going to be able to deliver to the segment. So you might not be able to have what you previously planned in terms of full capability. And why is that okay, right? So then going back to that North Star, what's our purpose? How does that translate into what we do every day? How does that translate to our teams? And are we aligned to it? And then getting human. I think, again, that sounds so simple and basic, but just having a real human-centered approach to building up resiliency and to looking at our teams and our organizations is made up of people, right? And I know at some point, we'll have AI and it'll be different, right? But we are made up of people and we're all dealing with these stressors in different ways, but we can become more resilient. We can build up our threshold for how the stress will keep us down, right? And I think that's something that I am focusing on. I did create a do not do list, and I know we've talked about this, Angelo, things that I'm going to let go in 2022 so I can focus on the things that are my true priorities, right? And that might mean saying no to things that I otherwise would say yes to from a work perspective and a professional perspective. I think Vanessa and I were just talking about this when you jumped on, right? Sometimes, it's really getting clear about what we can accomplish while maintaining physical and emotional well-being, and allowing that to guide us in our actions and communicating with those around us. So go ahead, Angelo.
Judith, having spent the time that we have together with the whole team, talking about these things has actually been in some ways stress relief because we've been dealing with them. Mm-hmm. And so, I always remember when people say, or I'll read in business books where they say, the biggest reason that people leave their company sometime is, most times is that for their manager. Mm-hmm. And how their manager's dealing with things. This is a perfect time for that transparency, as you mentioned, that I think this should be talked about. If you have employees, they should not be walking around, at least during the 8 to 10 hours they're working, or however many hours that is, thinking that they're the only one bothered by these things.
Yeah.
I think that work is a great opportunity to have an opportunity to have discussions like this, like we just had, so that people realize they're not the only ones that are bothered by the possibility that COVID may come back, or the possibility that, something could happen. And what should we do in preparation for that? So I think that we've really had a great opportunity, and, those who have had the opportunity to be with us during this time have also seen how that is. It shouldn't stop here, though.
Yeah, I think you're right. This is just a very start, and it's so refreshing to be able to have these honest conversations about resiliency, to really take and assess and look at, our clients and what they're doing to build up resiliency, to create space and flexibility and adaptability, to look at our own lives, right, and how we're showing up. And to maybe even recognize that we're experiencing change fatigue, and that's okay, because resiliency is a skill that we can get better at and our organizations can get better at. So if you feel like when you looked at that list, maybe there are some areas you want to focus on, pick one. Think about what you want to do. I love these ideas for what you want to do in 2022. and focus on that and take steps to getting to a better place. So then when we have this conversation again in a few months, you can share what you learned. You can share what you've done to really help build up those resiliency, attributes in your teams, in yourself, and in your organizations. Anything else, put in the chat. Any other thoughts as we kind of go wind down? Yeah, looking at long-term and short-term solutions. I love that. John, I don't know if you can come off mute, or Melissa, or if you want to share. You've had some great things in the chat. A little bit more about your perspective. I think you're unmuted, John, if you want to share. I put you on the spot. Go ahead.
No, that's fine. I'm usually on the spot. I think one thing that's important is to have that cohort, those peers around you that are doing similar things as you are. That maybe not in your space, but that you work with them together in a peer group or a group coaching situation. And that is important because those people know what you're going through. They can empathize better than other people. And they've already had some solutions, but even better than that, they've already made some mistakes. And if you have a really open and honest group, those are the most valuable conversations you can ever have. Because they already made that mistake. You can avoid doing that yourself.
Absolutely.
I love that all takes time. That all takes time, and it's not always important. I mean, it's important, but not always urgent. So it's an investment. It's a bank account of relationships and ideas to use.
John,
yeah, I love that.
I know John. I thought I did, and he heads up the executive forum. I think you facilitate the executive forum, so you have a good topic to bring back with you.
Yes, I do. In fact, that was the topic we were talking about in different ways with my CFO group today.
That's awesome.
Yeah, and I think, again, the more we have these conversations, the more we'll be able to share. Like I've shared with a couple of clients, what are you doing? We've had like kind of those water cooler conversations over Zoom. Like, what are you doing this year? What are your thoughts around, resiliency and what you want to do to fight some of the fatigue of burnout that people are experiencing? And they've shared some ideas, we've talked from everything about if a meeting goes more than 50 minutes, that at minute 30, everyone takes a 5-minute break to turn off their cameras and walk away, right? Just the moving, stepping outside, right? Pushing back from your desk, having meeting-free days. I know that some organizations are doing this and it's paying dividends. There was a study that said the more meeting-free days you had, the higher the employee engagement. And, baby steps, right? How do you take these grains of lessons and apply it for your circumstance? It's going to be different for each of us. But again, what's on your do not do list? Is it dinner on Wednesdays? I've shared that anecdotally, but then it's other things, right? It's like, okay, I'm going to replace one meeting this week with an email, right? And we're going to work asynchronously. And how does that, impact us? So I love your ideas. Drop your ideas. John, thank you for sharing.
And John had an old basic idea, which is, really to focus on what's important versus urgent. So many times, especially in these days where lots of things seem to be happening, we get caught up in the things that are just urgent, and taking that step back and being mindful. I think that's an important part too in building up resiliency, but building it up in a smart way. Don't build it up with things that aren't really that important once you take a look at it.
Last night I was talking to a colleague and we were talking about the intentional things that you do to feed your soul, things that make you feel good. And, you know, I shared that I like to crochet first thing in the morning, that I find it sets me in a very calm and focused way at the start of the day. And she shared how she likes to read books and said that, you know, she had gotten out of the habit of making time to do it. And, you know, and I said, I think that does build your resilience of being able to step back and do something that just feels good for the sake of feeling good. Right. So I said, even for me, I'll set a timer for 15 minutes so I don't have to worry. Am I getting caught in the vortex and, you know, not going to be ready to be on time, or that I'm sitting there saying, you know, I should be worried and thinking about other things. So it's taking that step back, you know, really does give you some strength to spring forward. Maybe that goes along with your do not do list, Judith, you know, maybe.
Well, it's creating that space to do what does fill you up. And that's powerful, whether it's a walk, whether it's crochet, whether it's reading. You know, I think a lot of us, our workday has expanded because it can,
Yeah.
right? And how do we assess honestly,
Yeah.
you know, how we're interacting and how our day is flowing?
Yeah. And a lot of people say too, right? Oh, I feel guilty if I take the time to do that, or I'm so busy, I don't have time to, you know, allow anything for myself, right? So some of that is, again, you know, maybe looking at what you can do or not do, that you don't end up in those situations of, right, wearing yourself down, I guess, right? That you've got to be able to recognize something's got to pivot and change, and this doesn't feel good at this moment. But I think with the you know, things that have happened over the last year, that's been really hard because you don't have time to absorb and get comfortable, you know, with whatever that one change is before something else comes along. I appreciated all the great tips that you know, you've shared today, and that I've heard, you know, been lucky enough to hear you share over time. So it's always good to have these conversations, you know, and hear how other people are dealing with it and facing with it as well. Sort of it's not just me.
It's all of us, right? It's all of us.
Definitely. Well, thank you, Angelo and Judith. If anyone has any other questions, or if you would like to connect more, Angelo and Judith's information is up on the screen. And like I said at the beginning, this will be in your inbox in the next few days. But thanks again, and we hope to see you again soon. All right, have a good afternoon, everyone. Thank you.
Thanks all.